Hey everyone, welcome back. It's Bryce from Develop Mindfully. You might have noticed this channel's undergone some rebranding. It's been a long time since my last tutorial, I think about a year now, so I thought I'd make one that's kind of a follow-up to one of the last ones that I made. And I have a fun new project to go along with it, and I think you'll find this one interesting and useful. So this is what we're going to be building. We're going to be building a web app that will let us import CSV spreadsheet data into the app, plot it on a map, and then you can use the map to basically generate a route with different directions, and then finally export a useful PDF report at the end that can do some cool things. So the idea here is to kind of combine a bunch of little interesting pieces of something you could combine into a web app, trying out some interesting libraries. And here's the best part, we won't be hosting it, so you can run it from your computer whenever you want and use it as if it's a desktop app, even though it's just a bundled set of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. So in terms of dev, we'll be using Bootstrap 4 to make a basic responsive layout, some ES6 features of JavaScript, and Webpack for bundling our JavaScript files and assets. We'll also be using jQuery for the few interactions, and a couple other interesting libraries for working with PDF files, and of course the Google Maps API. So just to give a little bit of backstory on how this came to be, after posting my Google Maps API tutorial about a year ago, a viewer reached out and asked me about a specific way to use the API for doing real estate work. So this gentleman who lives out in Miami, Florida, uses a property listing service in combination with a CRM website to scope out properties for his realty business, and more often than not this involves knocking on doors at each location, meeting with prospective clients, and that type of thing. So he worked out a process himself where he could import his Excel spreadsheet data into Google Maps My Maps web app, where they would be able to plan the shortest and most effective route to take to visit a list of properties for that day. So he would print the directions and follow that route, and after each visit to a listing, he would take notes on paper, and then later on when he had the time go and update his entry in his CRM if the listing should be revisited, discarded, or otherwise. And this process worked, but it had a lot of manual steps, the printing, bringing it out in the field, coming back, and then having to update it on the computer. So I worked with him to build a simple web page that would let him import his data, show it on a map, plan out his route for the day, and then export a PDF that would let him take the notes. So this project was tailored specifically to his needs in the real estate space. So what we'll be building today will be a bit more general, but it also could be extended if you wanted to dig a little bit deeper. So if you want a quick overview for working with the Maps API in general, I would suggest checking out my other video, including how to sign up for an API key. So I'll provide a link to that down below. And just another note, once you've got the API key set up, be sure that you have the Directions API, Geocoding API, and Maps JavaScript API all enabled. We'll be using these features in our app. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get into it. All right, so I'm going to start by creating a new folder for our project. So we'll call this CSV import for Maps API. And this probably goes without saying, but just in case you haven't done it, you're going to want to have Node.js and NPM installed. We're going to be using that to install some of our tools today. So with that being said, I'm going to npm init our project. That's just going to fill in some default things for us there. I'm also just going to zoom in, make this a little bit bigger so you can actually see. Okay, and we're going to get started just by installing some of our dev tools, mainly Webpack and some other related packages. So I'm just going to copy and paste the command here just for time's sake. So we're going to npm install Webpack, Webpack CLI, Webpack dev server, and these are development requirements. And next we just have some extra loaders that will be fed into Webpack. I'll explain those as we get to them. And finally some Babel packages that will be used to enable some of the ES6 features of JavaScript. And one more, .env, which we'll use to pass our Maps API key into our Webpack build process without having to embed it directly in the static HTML file. So it'll just get inserted once at build time. That'll make more sense as we get into it. But essentially, Webpack, if you haven't used it before, it's just this amazing utility that takes all of our static HTML, CSS, and JavaScript modules and bundles them together for us into a couple of core files. And the output is what we will open to run the web app in a browser. So the configuration that we'll be using is pretty close to the default one that you'll find. I'll post a link to where you can easily get started with Webpack if you're new to it. But to configure how our assets will be bundled, we're going to want to create a folder here, or sorry, a file here in the root called webpack.config.js. So just to save some time, I'm just going to copy and paste these configurations into our file. And I'll circle back in a minute to explain each of these rules individually, but really what we'll focus on for the moment are these module rules here. So the first rule specifies that the Babel loader be applied to JavaScript files, and this allows us to use all the features of ES6 and beyond, and all to be safely transpiled for use across all browsers. And the second specifies the style and CSS loaders, which will be applied to our CSS files. So this is a pretty common setup that I copied from the Babel.js website. And now we need to create another configuration file. This one will be called .babelrc. And in here, I'm just going to copy and paste once again. This will enable the presets and transforms for ES 2015 Plus used by the Babel loader that I just mentioned. Again, this probably seems maybe a little arbitrary, but I'll leave a link in the description to the setup guide that helped put this together. Easy enough. So finally, we just need to add a couple of NPM scripts to our package.json. We're just going to get rid of that test one here. And once again, just going to copy and paste these. So we have our, these scripts will allow us to either build or run a development mode for our Webpack dev server, which will let us take advantage of live recoding as we write our code. So I'm just going to save that. And if we move back to our Webpack config file, we can see a number of things happening here. So we have some dev tool entries that will enable the Webpack dev server here, also providing the directory where it's going to serve the content from. We also have this entry option, which specifies the path to our entry JavaScript file. This is where all of our imports will be specified, and Webpack will transpile and bundle it all for us. And if we go to the output option, here we specify the name of our bundle and where to write it to, using the path library provided there too. And our module rules again specify the Babel loader for our JavaScript files, and then style loader and CSS loader for our CSS. So we have our JavaScript and CSS handled nicely, but we also want our HTML to be output when we're bundling, and we'll do this through the HTML Webpack plugin. So not only does this allow us to do things like minify the output code, but we are also taking advantage of using a template which allows us to avoid embedding our Maps API key directly in the source file, just in case you wanted to, say, put the HTML code into like a GitHub repository or something like that. You wouldn't want to embed your creds directly in the source code. Instead, we're going to make that happen at build time so that you can keep that process secure and outside of the source code itself. So instead, we're going to store our API key in a .env file, which I'll create now. And when we bundle, the .env library will be able to read the environment variable and pass it into the template that we create, and into the script tag for embedding the Google Maps JavaScript API into our web app. And we'll switch back to our Webpack config. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit here. Alright, so So we're going to import our plugin, and then we're also going to initialize.env, which we require, and then we call config. And then we're just going to provide that plugin with some configurations down here. So if we go plugins, which is an array, and new HTML Webpack plugin, which will take a JSON object and we'll provide it with some parameters. So we're going to give it a title. We'll call it import CSV data for Google Maps API. And we're going to specify the template as well. So this will be the path to it. We're going to create a folder called source, and then within there we're just going to have a index.html file. And now we're going to specify our own variable that we'll be able to access inside of the template. We'll call that API key. And we're going to access that environment variable by doing process.env.api key. And finally, we're also just going to add some minification here, and we're going to say collapse white space true. Now there's obviously a whole bunch of other configurations that you could possibly make if you'd like. We're not going to get into those, but make sure to look up that HTML Webpack plugin if you're interested in that. So we're just going to save that. I'm going to go back. So this is where we're going to specify our API key, and we will copy and paste that now. There we are. I'm just going to close that. So awesome. We've installed all of our dev dependencies and tools and put together our bundling process. So I'd say it's about time we jump into some code, starting with our HTML template. So as we specified here, we're going to need to create a folder called source, and within that we're just going to create a new file called index.html. And we'll use VS Code's handy snippet there just to generate some code for us. And in here, we're going to fill in the template portion to pass in the data from our Webpack config file, so which will be the title and the API key options. So to get at those, we're going to use this funny looking syntax within this percent signs here, like this. So HTML Webpack plugin, and then we're going to go to .options, and then we're going to grab the title. Perfect. And then we're also going to add our script tag, which contains the Google Maps API reference. So the key is also going to be embedded into this source attribute. We also have the places library. This is very important. We'll be using this later. But this is really the meat of it right here. Once again, we have this syntax where we can inject our variable from our Webpack config. As you can see here, we can access the title or the API key, just like that. So just to note, this is called the Lodash template syntax, which is used by default by the plugin, but you could also, this plugin also allows for other popular templating tools like EJS or Handlebars if you'd like. Now we want to go to our command line and install a couple of base packages for our front end, starting with jQuery and Bootstrap. So I'm just going to copy and paste that command down here. So that's jQuery, Bootstrap, and popper.js. These are just things that are together for Bootstrap's JavaScript requirements. So we're just going to install those. Great. And finally, we're going to install the jsPDF library and the AutoTable extension for this library, which will allow us to generate cool PDF files just using client-side code. So I'm going to run that now. Alright, and to import the CSS and JavaScript to get started, we'll create the entry point JavaScript file that we pointed to earlier in our Webpack config file. So we're going to make a directory under source called JS, and we're going to create a file called index.js. So with our loaders configured, all we have to do is import the CSS and JavaScript like we would any other modules. So I'm just going to copy and paste these statements in. So we're importing the main Bootstrap style sheet as well as custom style sheet that we will supply here as well. So we're going to create that just within the same source folder, style.css. And we'll just add a quick rule in here just to show that it's working. And we'll call this, give this a background color of a bit of a gray here just to see that it's working. And then back in our index.js, let's just import jQuery. And we'll put a little ES6 into action as well. So within our main jQuery listener, I'm just going to supply an arrow function, and then we're going to alert hello world. What better way? All right, and lastly, in our index file, we're just going to add a little bit of code just to show that it's working. We're just going to put a h1 tag in here, just a title. And we'll just put some text in here. Let's say CSV data for Maps API. All right, and now we can see this running if we want to just run the command npm run dev, which if we take a quick peek at our package.json, that's going to run this dev script here, and it's going to start the Webpack dev server. So we're going to run that now. Oh, and we're getting some errors here. That's okay. We are missing some quotes. All right, there we are. So we can see that our JavaScript loaded in, as well as our index.html file, our template, and our CSS. So stay tuned. We're going to be really getting into the meat of our app next. And if you're enjoying this tutorial, please support this video by clicking like, and also subscribe to Develop Mindfully if you'd like to see more coding tutorials or content like this. And thank you. We'll see you in the next one.